In the early morning hours of November 20th, 1969, a group of Native Americans known as the Indians of all tribes made their way to Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. The island, once a federal prison, was uninhabited at the time. Evading a Coast Guard blockade, the group successfully occupied the island. The 19-month-long occupation that followed became one of the most significant acts of political resistance in Native American history. Before the arrival of European explorers, approximately 10,000 indigenous people from the Ohlone tribes inhabited the San Francisco Bay Area and its surroundings. The Ohlone people had lived in this region for thousands of years. Organized into around 50 smaller groups, they did not consider themselves a unified entity. They were hunter-gatherers and fishermen who relied on the rich resources of the bay. Alcatraz Island, in particular, served as an essential site for transport and food gathering, as bird eggs were collected on the island, and fishing off its shores was common. Additionally, the island held spiritual significance, functioning as a ceremonial site and occasionally as a place to isolate community members who violated tribal laws. The 1969 takeover of Alcatraz was not the first attempt to reclaim the island. In 1963, Belva Cottier, a Sioux social worker in the San Francisco Bay Area, read about the closure of Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary and plans to transfer the property to the city of San Francisco. Recalling the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, which stipulated that surplus federal land should be returned to Native Americans, Cottier and Richard Mackenzie cited the treaty to argue that the Sioux people could lay claim to the island. On March 8, 1964, a small group of Sioux staged a demonstration occupying the island for 4 hours. The group, comprising about 40 individuals, including a lawyer who filed a legal claim to the land on their behalf, aimed to assert their rights and highlight their connection to the land. They were soon removed by the Coast Guard. Despite its brevity, this initial takeover was significant because the participants called for the island to be used as a cultural center and a Native American university. These demands would resurface during the larger occupation of 1969. For years, Native Americans in the Bay Area had been organizing another attempt to reclaim Alcatraz. When news broke that the city planned to sell the island to a billionaire developer, activists decided it was time to act. The late 1960s was a period of intense social change, marked by civil rights movements, student protests, and a reevaluation of societal norms. On November 9, 1969, Richard Oakes and a group of supporters made a symbolic attempt to claim Alcatraz Island for Native American people. Their demands echoed those made during the 1964 Sioux occupation, emphasizing the need for a cultural center and university. The plan involved organizing 5 boats to transport approximately 75 Native Americans to the island, but none of the boats arrived. Undeterred, the group boarded a boat called the Monte Cristo and convinced the captain to circle the island. As they approached Alcatraz, Richard Oakes, Jim Vaughn, Joe Bill, Ross Hardin, and Jerry Hatch jumped into the water, attempting to swim to the island. However, the Coast Guard quickly intervened and rescued them. The media dismissed the action as a publicity stunt, but it drew attention to the movement. Later that day, a larger group, led by Richard Oakes and Lenata Warjack, then known as Lenata Means, departed from Fisherman's Wharf and successfully reached the island. 14 people stayed overnight, marking the beginning of a more significant and sustained occupation. The following day, Richard Oakes delivered the now famous Alcatraz Proclamation. We, the Native Americans, reclaim this land known as Alcatraz Island in the name of all American Indians by right of discovery. We wish to be fair and honorable in our dealings with the Caucasian inhabitants of this land, and hereby offer the following treaty. This declaration underscored the group's determination to assert their rights and reclaim the island as a symbol of Native American resilience and self-determination. We will purchase said Alcatraz Island for $24 in glass beads and red cloth, a precedent set by the white man's purchase of a similar island approximately 300 years ago. We understand that $24 in trade goods for these 16 acres is more than was paid when Manhattan Island was sold, but we also acknowledge that land values have risen over the years. Our offer of $1.24 per acre exceeds the 47 cents per acre the white man is currently paying California Indians for their land. We will allocate a portion of this land to the inhabitants of the island to be held in trust by the American Indian government for as long as the sun shall rise and rivers flow. To the sea, to be administered by the Bureau of Caucasian Affairs. Richard Oakes initially negotiated with authorities for the protesters to leave Alcatraz without facing arrest. After returning to the mainland, however, the group resolved to make another attempt, this time with better organization. On the night of November 20th, 1969, the symbolic occupation escalated into a large-scale demonstration when 89 Native Americans, primarily university students, along with women and children, boarded boats from a location 30 miles south of San Francisco and successfully landed on Alcatraz Island. They justified their action by invoking the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, which stipulated that surplus federal land should be returned to Native Americans. Once on the island, the protesters quickly organized themselves, with Richard Oakes becoming the unofficial mayor of Alcatraz. They established a governing council and arranged for security, sanitation, daycare, a school, and housing. The occupation drew attention to the plight of Native Americans, specifically their treatment under the Indian Termination Policy, which aimed to assimilate Native peoples and eliminate tribal sovereignty. The protesters accused the federal government of violating numerous treaties. Though largely overlooked by mainstream media at the time, Lenata Warjack, then Lenata Means, was one of the key leaders of the occupation. Arriving on the first day and among the last to leave, she played a crucial role in drafting speeches and proposals. She called for full Native control of Alcatraz Island, citing the Treaty of Fort Laramie as the legal basis for their claim. Warjack envisioned the island as a Native cultural center with full-time Native consultants, teachers, librarians, and staff who would educate visitors about the history and culture of Native peoples. In one of his communications to the U.S. Department of the Interior, Richard Oakes stated, "We invite the United States to acknowledge the justice of our claim. The choice now lies with the leaders of the American government, to use violence upon us as before to remove us from our Great Spirit's land, or to institute real change in its dealings with the American Indian. We do not fear your threat to charge us with crimes on our land. We, along with all other oppressed peoples, would welcome the spectacle of proof before the world of your title by genocide. Nevertheless, we seek peace." Initially, federal negotiators demanded the protesters vacate the island. However, public opinion began to shift in favor of the occupation, and the government adopted a stance of non-interference. Public support grew, with many Americans expressing solidarity with the Native Americans' demands. Advocates ranged from show business celebrities to unlikely allies such as the Hells Angels. Despite growing public support, the logistical challenges of sustaining the occupation became apparent. Supplies had to be ferried to the island, but Coast Guard blockades made this increasingly difficult. Nevertheless, the Alcatraz occupation remains one of the most powerful symbols of Native American resistance and a turning point in the struggle for indigenous rights. Families, including children, joined the occupation, and in its early days, the island was home to approximately 150 people. At the peak of the takeover, however, the population on Alcatraz swelled to around 400. Support for the protesters was widespread. On Thanksgiving Day, restaurants and community members donated food to sustain those on the island. In December 1969, John Trudell, who would soon become the voice of the Alcatraz movement, began broadcasting daily updates under the name Radio Free Alcatraz. In January 1970, the protesters also started publishing a newsletter to share their message with a broader audience. The government's initial reluctance to use force was influenced by the widespread public and media support for the occupation. In a symbolic gesture, the government even provided water to the island in November and engaged in discussions about the social needs of Native Americans. These talks, often held informally in the old mess hall, included offers like allocating a portion of Fort Miley in San Francisco as an alternative site. However, the protesters, firmly committed to their cause, rejected any compromise that did not involve Native control of Alcatraz. The movement drew significant support from notable figures, including Jane Fonda, Marlon Brando, Anthony Quinn, Buffy Sainte-Marie, Jonathan Winters, and Dick Gregory. The band Creedence Clearwater Revival donated $15,000, which was used to purchase a boat named the Clearwater for transporting supplies and people to the island. The protest also garnered support from various activist groups, including the American Indian Movement (AIM), the Black Panthers, the Brown Berets, and members of the Asian and white communities. Around New Year 1970, many Native students who had initially joined the occupation returned to their schools, replaced by others who traveled to Alcatraz from across the United States. However, the growing number of non-Native participants, many of whom were associated with San Francisco's counterculture scene, introduced challenges. Despite an early agreement prohibiting drugs and alcohol on the island, some newcomers violated this policy, undermining the occupation's original principles. Additionally, internal power struggles emerged between groups vying for leadership, further complicating the movement. A tragedy struck on January 3, 1970, when 12-year-old Yvonne Oakes, the daughter of Annie and Richard Oakes, fell from a stairway and died. Devastated, the Oakes family left the island, stating they no longer had the heart to continue. With Richard Oakes gone, leadership transitioned to figures like Lenata Warjack, John Trudell, Stella Leach, and Al Miller, who continued to organize and negotiate with the federal government. The federal government eventually rejected the protesters' demands for a university and cultural center on Alcatraz, instead proposing to transform the island into a Native American-themed park. When the protesters declined this offer, the government countered by designating the island as a national park. This, too, was rejected by the activists, who viewed these proposals as inadequate and dismissive of their goals. In response to the continued occupation, the government began cutting off essential resources. Electrical power to the island was shut off, and the water barge supplying fresh water was removed. These actions created significant hardships for the protesters, leaving them without basic necessities and marking a turning point in the occupation. In response to the government's removal of the water barge, supporters immediately began transporting water and generators to Alcatraz Island. Once again, public support from those on the mainland remained strong. However, on June 1, 1970, just 3 days after the removal of the water barge, a fire broke out on the island, engulfing several buildings. When the flames subsided, the warden's home, the lighthouse keeper's residence, and the officers' club were destroyed. The historic lighthouse, built in 1854, was also severely damaged. The cause of the fire remains unknown, with the government blaming the protesters and the protesters accusing undercover government agents of trying to turn public opinion against them. Despite the fire, public support for the occupation remained high. Across the country, people continued to protest, send supplies, and demand greater rights for Native Americans. As 1970 drew to a close, negotiations between the Native protesters and the government continued, but tensions persisted. In January 1971, 2 oil tankers collided in San Francisco Bay, further complicating the situation. Stories began to circulate about protesters stripping copper wiring from the island and selling it to purchase supplies, as well as allegations of physical altercations among those on the island. These reports, whether true or exaggerated, caused the media and public to lose interest in the occupation, leading to a decline in widespread support. This shift pushed the federal government to develop a plan for removal. On June 11, 1971, federal marshals executed their plan to retake Alcatraz Island with minimal force. Assisted by the Coast Guard, 20 armed marshals arrived on the island and removed the remaining protesters, 5 women, 4 children, and 6 unarmed Native men. After 19 months, the occupation of Alcatraz came to an end. Though the protesters' immediate demands were not realized, the occupation of Alcatraz had a lasting impact. It brought national attention to the struggles of Native Americans and contributed to significant policy changes. The Indian Termination Policy, which sought to assimilate Native peoples and dissolve tribal sovereignty, was formally ended. The federal government adopted a new policy of Native self-determination, empowering Native communities to take control of their own affairs. During the occupation, President Richard Nixon returned Blue Lake and 48,000 acres of land to the Taos Pueblo people. Additionally, lands near Davis, California, were designated for a Native American university. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA, began hiring Native Americans to work within the agency, giving them a voice in decisions that directly affected their lives. The Alcatraz takeover also inspired a wave of Native American protests and activism across the United States, sparking a broader movement for indigenous rights. In 1973, Alcatraz Island was officially opened as a national park, with memorials commemorating the occupation and its significance in history. Every year on November 20th, Native Americans return to Alcatraz to honor the occupation and celebrate their resilience and cultural heritage.